Now let's take a look at the G20 meeting set to kick off tomorrow in France as world leaders gather to discuss the global economy. Now, many people around the world are facing economic hardship and feel their leaders are disconnected. Perhaps this is the reason 10,000 protesters are there as well. But guess what? The protesters this year may be the least of the problems at the G20 summit. RT's own Anissa Nawi is on the ground in Cannes and joins me now. Anissa, all eyes seem to be on Greece in the context of what's going on with the global economy, especially in light of this meeting called by French President Nicolas Sarkozy and German Chancellor Angela Merkel. They've summoned Greek Prime Minister George Papandreou to talk about the proposed bailout referendum in Greece. What was this all about?
Well, basically, I think it's fair to say that the Euro crisis has pretty much hijacked this summit, which, like you said, mass protests around the world really calling on these leaders to revamp and completely, basically remodel the global financial system. Those cries obviously aren't going to be heard, first of all, because protesters are about 25 miles away in Nice. All of Cannes has been closed off, but also because of the Greek PM's bombshell that he was going to hold a referendum and ask his people, in fact, what they thought and what they want to do, whether or not they want to be bailed out by the IMF and the European Central Bank. And that's all what this summit is expected to be about. Right now, a meeting taking place between Sarkozy, Merkel, and the Greek PM, basically summoned here, like you said. A lot of critics that we spoke to say, jokingly with sarcasm, that he was summoned like a schoolboy. Well, back in Greece, the people we've been speaking to and that have been protesting for over a year now are certainly going to be happy that they finally are going to have some say in what happens to their economy and whether or not they stay in the Eurozone.
I want to talk about a couple things you just mentioned. First of all, that bombshell that was dropped certainly sent a lot of panic through the global economy. And the fact that you say people there want to talk about restructuring the entire global economy, those are tall orders. What is the mood like there? I mean, is there even a sense that something can be accomplished?
Well, it of course depends who you ask. I think it's going to be basically a showdown between Eurocrats, as some people call them, and Eurosceptics. Really one of the points that is going to be made by at least the BRICS countries, the emerging economies, which was made when the G20 was created back in 2008 to help us get out of the first financial crisis that many would say the banks got us into in the first place. The G20 making the G8 bigger, not just having the world's richest countries decide what happens. Has that really changed? Are we seeing any different? Obviously not. We're seeing protests from the US, the Occupy movement, which is growing there massively. Europe, the Arab Spring, people across the world don't like the balance of things. And it's not just about money. Of course, that's a tremendous issue when it comes to the G20. But people from the emerging economies to the poorer countries to people around the world want things to change. Whether or not the G20 will do that, some analysts that I've been speaking to don't think that's the case, especially with Greece. No matter what we hear tonight from Sarkozy or Merkel, whether or not they will reprimand the Greek PM, whether or not they will kind of push Greece to go through with this referendum and maybe try to sway the vote in one way or another. Many people think that when it comes down to it, the G20 will get what they want in terms of Greece.
Certainly interesting. Another thing that you mentioned about the protesters there being held, their protesting area, I guess, designated in Nice. I know that when I covered the G8 conference in Savannah, the protesters were about 30 miles away, so it's more for the media than for some of these world leaders actually coming in. Talk a little bit about this, as far as people feeling disconnected from their leaders, the people actually making decisions about the economy that will affect them.
Well, one analyst that we heard from today actually made an interesting point that these leaders can't anymore hide behind these tremendous steel walls, as he was calling them, or big fences like we saw back in Toronto, which people were livid about. All of this money going into security when there are people protesting around the world about how the whole global financial system is imbalanced. And then you have these protesters miles away. Of course, the leaders don't hear them. But this time there is a sense that, in a way, it's getting to the point where they're not going to be able to ignore them for much longer. Like I said, the Occupy movement growing tremendously, and it's not just an American thing anymore. We're seeing it around the world. Certainly, we're hearing about solidarity here in Europe with the Occupy movement, and whether or not a kind of really concrete result will come out of this meeting, whether it's about the Euro or about these protests. A lot of people are not reluctant, so they don't think there will be any huge decisions made here, but how much longer can these leaders, especially the G7, the world's richest countries, ignore the cries of these protesters? That's the big question.
Just very briefly, Anissa, anything else we should keep our eyes out for in terms of what's on the agenda?
Well, that's the thing. This agenda was supposed to be huge. It was supposed to talk about the Arab Spring, all of the changes we've seen in North Africa, Gaddafi. Are they going to talk about it? It looks like really that the euro is going to take over. A lot of countries, like those BRICS countries, perhaps not going to be happy that an issue that doesn't directly touch them is pretty much not going to be touched here.
Certainly an interesting time for an economic summit talking about the global economy. RT correspondent Anissa Nawi bringing us the latest from Cannes in France.